joined the company I'm now working for, which is called Softbank Robotics. So we have several robots and specifically, if you think about the whole Softbank groups, we have many robots. Some of them are really often in the news. If you think about the Boston Dynamics one, the two robots that Softbank Robotics focuses on are Now, which is the one on the left, and it's robot that's all focused on educational and research markets. And I'm working on Pepper, which is the one on the right. And Pepper is dedicated to B2B2C, mostly focusing on environments, brick and mortar environments, retail, whether it's shops, banking, etc., etc. And the goal of Pepper is to transform how customer connect with businesses. And if you think about what Pepper does, one of the usual things that we like to talk about is automating the task, the really repetitive task that you would have in the retail environment. So if you think really like a shop, such as a department store, or whatever it is, if you ever work as a sales associate and you've been close to the entrance, you probably spend your days repeating the same thing and mostly answering the same question over and over and over again. So that's the kind of things that Pepper can do. And if you think integration, as soon as you integrate Pepper with other technologies, we're thinking expanding, we're talking expanding, and really bringing the online to the brick and mortar. And if you think about the retail markets, making the bridge between those two is really important. So let me talk about robots now. So I have a question for you, but first I'd like to know who works in robotics or AI, and those two guys I know. Okay. And do you have? I did not involve chatbots, but for me it was kind of covered in AI, even if the definition is blurry. Okay. So the question I have for you is, what is a robot? And I'd like you to give me your answer. So there are two kind of answers I'm expecting. One of them is the usual definition, like the engineering kind of definition, because I know this is the kind of thing where this is the kind of answer that are brought. But basically also broadly, what do you think with the word robots?
Any machine that perceives, sense, and elaborates something, adds to or bit of that.
Okay, that's a good engineering kind of definition. I have a Wikipedia kind of definition for that. What kind of robots are in your mind when you think about robots?
Non-engineering, R2D2.
R2D2, yeah. Yep, yeah. Okay. No, that's, you kind of like get the idea of where I was bringing you. So one interesting thing, if you think product management, the engineering definition of a robot, I mean, I think that's from Wikipedia, is a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of action automatically, especially one programmable by computer. So that's the usual engineering definition. But what's interesting, if you do product for robotics, and it kind of extends to AI and chatbot, I'll do the parallels when they're really relevant, is that basically you're working on a product that has been in the mind of people this way. And when you talk about robots, the first thing that comes to a lot of people is fiction. And robotics has been in fiction for a while, actually. And to one interesting thing that I researched was really the roots of robotics, basically. And the really interesting thing is actually focusing on the word robot itself. And the word robot comes from a play from 1920 by a Czech author called Karel Čapek in a play called Rossum's Universal Robots. I'm not going to read the Czech translation of it, but you get it. And what's interesting is just the word robot comes from the Czech robota, which means hard work, serf labor, because in the play, you have to think about the timeline here as like we're talking 1920, we're talking post-World War I, and it's literally factories like industrial era coming back from the World War I, and we're talking factories where humans are working crazy amount of hours on a very repetitive tasks. And so in the play, the factory managers, whatever, the owner of the factory, decide to replace humans by those machines that are really human-like. So that's actually a photo of what you can say is literally the first robot. What's interesting is that is that because of the context, basically those machines that were really human-like did the same thing that humans were really doing back then, which is rebel against the power, rebel against the people that put them in such a hard and repetitive work. So there's a lot on the fiction that drove our assumptions on robotics, and especially if you just look at the definition of the word robot and its roots, you kind of like get a lot. Why do people fear robots? Because in the origin of the work, in the origin of the word, robots were already fighting against human, because it was mostly a representation of some low-income humans fighting against other humans. So that's something that is interesting from kind of like a philosophical standpoint, because it comes back to our fear of machines, robots, whether it's autonomous car or a more human-like robot, et cetera, comes mostly from, in the Western countries, the fact that we have the belief that everything that the man creates, man or woman, like as humanity creates, will turn against itself, because in the root of that, there's the idea that life can only come from God, and it's mostly in the Christian and all the other Western countries. It's I just talk about the highlights on the Western countries, because that's where the name robots, the word robots came from. But it's really different in other cultures. And if you think, for example, Japan, and I work in Japanese groups, the whole thing I'm talking about tonight is going to be really different in Japan. So basically, robots have been there for a century. And the interesting thing is that they have been with us in fiction, but for a lot of people, all those fictional characters really have been living with them. If you asked, the one on the right is I think the coolest robot from the Star Wars saga. It's K2SO. What does it mean in terms of products? That's this idea that you have a product that has been there before you actually made it, basically. It's a product of the imagination. And I tend to mostly think about robots and AI, because if you think robots and AI in general as like an artificial intelligence, whether it's like a machine that talks, whatever the kind of machine it is, it's the main kind of products that actually have been there the way we're about to put them everywhere. If you think other fictional products, it hasn't been the same. I tend to always talk about flying cars, because the interesting thing is that even like 30 years ago, we're thinking that we would be piloting cars that are flying. And in the end, the reality is that we're most likely, and we actually already have in our streets, cars that are on the road, but that do not need us to be driven. Same thing for smartphones, same thing for a lot of things. It was not that much similar to what was in the fiction. So a big thing about that you need to think about in terms of product are expectations. I can't talk enough about how you need to manage the expectations, and at every level, whether it's from a product marketing standpoint, whether it's if you're doing a B2B robot, thinking about in business meetings, basically, how do you answer the questions? You really have to manage the expectations, because fiction put the expectations way higher than what you'll be able to achieve. And it's the case with robots, but if you think about it, it's even the case with the Roomba. The usual example I had was conversation about buying a Roomba or not buying a Roomba. And if you have a Roomba, one, you need to have the right home for a Roomba. As soon as you have stairs, it's going to be different. And the other thing is, people realize most of the time after purchasing the Roomba that if you have stuff like if you let laundry, whatever you put, you have to actually kind of like prepare for the Roomba, because right now, and I mean, it's getting way better and better, but it's not doing everything. And it's also true. I have an example of overselling, basically. And I don't mean that to talk bad about a company or another, but I see a lot of ads for AI products. One interesting one was, I don't know if I should say the name. It's the companion of Sherlock Holmes. It's made by a big company. And in their ads, you basically have the AI talking with a voice to people. And actually, it's not even just chatting, it's conversing and bringing a lot of very, very complex things. What's interesting in that is that you basically create the expectation, maybe not to highly educated people that know already their stuff about the reality of the AI market, but you basically create a lot of expectations to regular people in what exactly is your product. And a lot of them will assume that it's a super smart intelligence, and when they actually end up using it directly or indirectly, they realize that it's mostly specialized in this specific field or that specific field. So that's really something you need to think about as soon as you talk, as soon as you work on one of those products that have been there for a while. The main one for me being robots. Basically think baby steps, set the bar really low, and try to bring down the bar that has been set before you. The other thing is thinking, having like a user-centered approach. Specifically now, in that case in robotics, most of the time, robotics is thought as engineering. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to create that complex hardware thing or software thing, that complex algorithm. It's great, and it is needed. I'm not going to say anything against that, but I would challenge that you would probably need at least half of what you put in engineering in design, because whatever the capabilities of the products you're doing, you have to think that people will have those expectations, will have probably not the right expectations, and will be maybe even afraid of it in the beginning. They will be challenged by, okay, how do I use that? And okay, it's supposed to do that kind of thing, but what does it mean exactly? In terms of design, what I usually chat about with design team I'm working on is we can apply the series. We need to be aware of the best practices. It's a whole new paradigm. Basically, I tend to talk about robotics and, again, kind of like putting AI in the same buckets. As new as was the personal computer in the 80s, as new as was the iPhone or the smartphones 10 years ago. Was it 10 years ago? Something like that. So you really need to put a lot of focus in having a usable product, whatever kind of robot you have. And the third thing about that is be humble. That's Jon Snow. I have a picture on top of my display because I want to remind myself, you know nothing, Jon Snow. I like, to give you an example, prepping this presentation, I had a conversation with our PR person, and we were talking about how we need to reinvent a lot of things, and we don't know exactly if what we do is the right thing, etc., because we need to start from scratch a lot of things. And she told me that even in her role, she has to start from scratch. She can't reapply all the recipes that she has. So really, do not think that you know exactly, because whatever the great experience I wish you had in web, mobile, or whatever kind of product, if you're tackling those kind of products, it's a new ground. You're not you don't. I mean, specifically if you're starting, you won't have all the experience. It's not going to be as usable as what you did with the usual product you did. So that's mostly it for robots. I'm going to talk a little bit now about B2B, B2C, and B2B2C. So let's focus on B2B first. The idea, if you work in product, is working in B2B means that you drive your value proposition towards a business. It means that you think about the pain points they have that you can solve. You think about the gains that you can bring. The specificity with B2B is that you can probably customize more than in B2C. If you think integration, as an example, you might have a service, and you might have for that specific customer an integrator that's going to customize more for the specific business. What do you get? What do you get in exchange from the business? Money. So you get the more you fine-tuned your value proposition towards the business, the more likely you are to sell it and to have the market fit. In the beginning, you're going to get money. I also tend to really highlight the fact that over time, if you did a good job, you're going to you're going to get more money, and you're going to get also loyalty, basically. So that's for B2B. For B2C, it's like nothing crazy. You drive your value proposition towards consumers. In that case, you're really thinking about individuals. You're probably segmenting to target a very specific segment of consumers. And in exchange, of that value proposition being driven the right way, you get money. Same thing over kind of like that's kind of like an instant photo. But if you think over time, you're going to get more revenue and loyalty. I have a question about that for B2C. Who here changed the ecosystem of their phone in the last 10 years? As like switching several, so let's say switching several times from Android to iOS. Who did that? Okay, it's actually a high number. The usual example with how you can address well the B2C market is create the usual ecosystem that we know really well, and you don't usually have that many hand raise. So now let's talk about B2B2C. So this is your business. This is the B2B, and this is the clients, like the customers of the client on the right. Question I have is, how does it work here? Who do you consider in your value proposition? The one in the bottom? Yes, yes. So yes, but I'd say that you would more focus on the one, the consumer, like the what we would consider the end user, because if you think over time, specifically, so the interesting part is you want to solve problems for your clients' customers. What comes with that is you get money from the client. Where it becomes interesting, and again, going not only on the photo of a specific instant, but over time, if you want that to happen more, if you targeted well and answered well the pain points of the consumer in the bottom, your client is going to get more revenue and more loyalty. And that's in the end how you will get more revenue and loyalty from the clients. What's interesting, if you think about B2B2C, there aren't that many examples, even if we tend to like more and more doing like complex acronyms to say, yeah, I'm in a very specific scenario. But I think that a lot of time companies target first the business. Where it's interesting is that over time, what's going to bring a strong relationship or partnership between, let's say, you and the business is that they actually get something from their customers. What's interesting in that is that in a way you don't really have direct control on the value being generated, because those are not your customers basically, and how your actual client, which is the business, uses your product is going to also impact how much value will be generated by its customers. So that's where I would say it becomes really, really interesting. So that's mostly what I had to talk about today. Thank you. Thank you.